Okay. So, thank you everybody for showing up, because this is the biggest audience I've talked to so far. I'm a bit nervous. Well, the nice lady already introduced me, so I'll skip this slide. Okay, so my introduction will set the stage, so to say, for the presentation. Then there will be 3 parts. The first steps I took in my voyage with BDD. Then the second part where everything started to work really well. And then the third part where we hit roadblocks, where things did not go so well, and what we could have learned from that. And then a short summary to recapture all the main points. So, financial sector. The product I worked on dealt with corporate actions. Corporate actions are things like companies like to announce stuff. They announce they're going to pay out a dividend. They announce that they would like to buy as many shares as possible of another company. Or, like Apple did some time ago, they announce they're going to retire their big $700 shares and split those shares in smaller shares of $100 each. Those are the things that companies announce. So these are just a few examples. Of course, there are a great many events. The product I worked on with the full name, AIM Gain Corporate Actions Data Manager. AIM is the name of the company. AIM stands for Advanced Information Management. They're a Vienna-based company. They have lots of customers in Switzerland, Luxembourg, private banks. Private banks value discretion, so I won't mention their names. And as it says on the slide, the mission of AIM is to improve the quality of data in the financial sector. And believe me, it needs a hell of a lot improving. Private banks, and here the diagram of the system. So the little purple box is the actual product. All the gray boxes are what happens before and after. So there's many data sources in the financial sector. Really a lot. Reuters, Bloomberg, the companies who hold shares, they deliver data, and each company, of course, has their own data format. And nobody can convince anybody to change their data format. So if the system of a bank, that one, wants to use all that data, it has to know all these different formats and map everything together. Or they can use a product like AIM Gain Corporate Actions Data Manager that does all this for them and gets the data in a good shape. The team. We had a product owner. We were doing Scrum, by the way. We had a domain expert. We had a person who was part-time Scrum Master, part-time developer. That was me. We had 5 developers. Yeah. And we had a code base. This code base was partly a static application, the shell, and then the actual products were implemented as a set of dynamic plugins. We had very few unit tests because the nature of this dynamic code thing meant that it was next to impossible to load classes in isolation. Sucks, that's the way it was. We did, however, have a reasonable amount of functional tests, but they were all end-to-end because we were able to spawn the whole system and run a message from input to output. But yeah, the whole system, and it was slow. Our challenges were mainly communication problems. We had communication problems between the product owner and the domain expert. We had then between the product owner and the developers. So we were going over a corner. We solved that problem by making the domain expert the product owner who talked directly to the developers. However, Swiss private banks requirements were in French. Only 2 of the people in the project, apart from the product owner, had any passing knowledge of French. We didn't have contact with the actual customer. For us, the buck stopped at the product owner. So now those first steps. we had a problem. I set out to solve it. So behavior driven development, working in .NET, that means using SpecFlow. Who has used SpecFlow? Come on, I can't be the only one. Thank you. Thank you. Now, SpecFlow is developed by an Austrian company, TechTalk. I actually used to work at TechTalk, but I never used SpecFlow. I only did a bit of behavior-driven development, and this was now going to change it big time. Because I read a couple of books by Gherkin Abuse. I'm sure you've heard of Gherkin Abuse. He's one of the leading guys in behavior-driven development. He wrote a really excellent Bridging the Communication Gap book. Read this book, just the first 2 chapters. All you need to know is in there. He wrote a second book, Specification by Example, which goes a bit more in how you implement the ideas from the first book. Very good books. I had a lot of inspiration from them. So with one user story, I set out to try those ideas. So I talked with a product owner. That's how I figure out the requirements. I then wrote a couple of Gherkin scenarios. Gherkin is the language we use for writing a behavior-driven development scenario. So if you do any kind of work with BDD, you will notice that everything has to do with cucumbers. The original tool is called Cucumber. Gherkin is a kind of cucumber. I work on an open source project, which is called Pickles, which are conserved cucumbers. So everything has to do with cucumbers. I then had a talk with a product owner. We reviewed those scenarios. And my impression of this session was, yes, finally I was able to pin down the product owner on making a clear, unambiguous statement. Finally, I knew when this input comes, then that should happen. No more half-baked, if, else, then, and then forgetting one case. No, this was it. I mentioned this to the product owner, and you know what he said? Finally, I had the feeling the developers understand what I'm talking about. Yeah? So I was happy, the product owner was happy, win all around. And then, oh noes, we didn't have automation. When you're doing work with behavior-driven development, soon you will arrive at automated UI testing or automated verification of those scenarios. We did not have that at first because, because of technical reasons. We would have liked it, but it didn't happen. And yet this was not a failure because the user story was implemented with far fewer problems than other user stories. Simply because of the improved communication, because of everybody understanding what the other person was saying, simply because of that fact, the development went far, far easier. So we had our Gherkin scenarios, and we used those as inspiration for a coded functional test. And we considered this a success. We haven't had no automation, but this was a success. Because BDD is about collaboration and communication. We obtained lots of value through improved communication and reduced misunderstandings. This is my core message today. So if you are pressed for time, you can leave now, but please remember, BDD gives value through improved communication and reduced misunderstandings. So we had now these nice Gherkin scenarios. If you've never seen them, they look like that. At the top, there's a feature, and then there's one or more scenarios. Each scenario uses given, when, then. The product owner said, yes, I'm convinced BDD is cool, but I cannot show this to a customer. It looks boring. If you want to have syntax highlighting and all that kind of cool stuff, then you need Visual Studio. Swiss private banks, business people, they do not have Visual Studio. So, but what about an HTML page? This is a web page. Just simply a web page which shows the title of the feature, the scenarios, the steps. This one was approved. So, and this is incidentally the kind of thing that Pickles creates. It's what is called a living documentation. Living, I'm sure everybody has surfed on Wikipedia. Wikipedia is a living encyclopedia. It's always up to date. As soon as new quantum particles are discovered, somebody goes on to the website, on the page of that quantum particle and says, it was discovered at CERN and blah, blah, blah. So always up to date, living. Documentation, well, your specification, it says the system does this, given, when, then. A documentation tells you the system does this. So we can use those scenarios as a documentation for the system. Hence, a living documentation, a documentation that's always up to date. And the best part is, unlike Wikipedia, we don't have to do anything by hand. Somebody updates the scenarios, yes, sure, and then Pickles will automatically update the documentation. So I've told this, I also told you that the scenarios can be documentation of the system. Right. Now, I also already mentioned Pickles, the second one. There's another living documentation generator called Relish. Well, relished are mashed up cucumbers put into some sauce. It's written in Ruby, it's closed source, the documentation needs to be hosted in the cloud, and the project appears to be stalled. Whereas Pickles is written in .NET, it's open source, you can do whatever you want with your documentation, and it's still being developed. So at AIM, we settled on Pickles, and then I got involved with Pickles, and by now I'm the maintainer of Pickles. The main reason we've picked Pickles is that you can host your documentation wherever you want. Relish forces you to store the documentation in the cloud, and you know, Swiss private banks, discretion, privacy, no way in hell they're going to do anything with the cloud. Okay, fast forwards a few months. We had a good routine going. We created Gherkin scenarios. We used those as inspiration for the functional tests. Development went much smoother. So we had increased communication, we had increased productivity, and the holy grail of Scrum, we had the increased velocity. However, we had less rework, but there was this topic of automation. Automated verification is a side effect of behavior-driven development, but it's still a nice side effect. You know, you want to have it. So we had another attempt. This time, I managed to do it. For one iteration, we had a time box with, okay, we'll try to implement, to do Gherkin scenarios with verification for 2 user stories. And life was good. This was one of the high moments in my voyage through BDD, on the level of the product owner finally telling me what he wanted to have. And then over time, we migrated all our functional tests to SpecFlow scenarios, to Gherkin scenarios that were converted into code using the SpecFlow tool. And yeah, this led then to the living documentation with test results. So here's another screenshot of living documentation. And you'll notice that there are these little marks here where it says, okay, this scenario, in the last test run, this scenario passed. The other scenario passed as well. So, and unfortunately, there are a few features that did not pass. So you now have this nicely formatted specification or documentation of your system, and it also shows you the current state of the implementation. Ideally, everything is green, of course, and then you know our system works as advertised. So the management really digs that kind of report. So those were the first steps where I discovered all the single aspects of behavior-driven development, and I figured out how they can work with our system, in our way of working. Now we went the next mile. Now we adapted our way of working in order to get even more benefit from behavior-driven development. So we changed the meetings we had. What meetings, behavior-driven development? Well, behavior-driven development is all about communication and collaboration. And where do people come together? In meetings. So we changed our meetings. I'm sure most of you know the basic Scrum meetings, so you'll recognize one or the other. We started off with the so-called pre-grooming session. We had one representative from each role. This is very much like the Three Amigos meeting. It's in fact exactly the same as the Three Amigos meeting. And the outcome of the pre-grooming is that for each user story, for each feature, you have sketches of scenarios. They're not fully formalized Gherkin yet, but they're bullets. You know everybody knows what it's about. Then for the grooming meeting, or the estimation meeting, the entire team is present. By that time, the Gherkin scenarios have been fully formalized, and the outcome of that meeting is an estimation for the user story. The sprint planning, again with the entire team, is now a very short meeting, because estimating the user stories has already been done. So in 10-15 minutes, we say, okay, dear product owner, velocity is so much, the user stories have been estimated, pick so many user stories. Done. And then, so in Scrum, the user stories are presented at the end of the sprint with the review meeting, and then the product owner says, well, you know, this is not actually exactly what I wanted to have. Story is not done, everybody is unhappy. So in order to combat this problem, we had instituted a pre-review where the product owner and the developer sit together and go through the user story like during the review, but they do it at one point during the iteration where the product owner has time to say, yeah, this little thingy must be changed. And ideally he says yes, right? That's the preview meeting. The outcome is approval by the product owner. And then in the actual sprint review, we present only the pre-reviewed stories. So the outcome of the sprint review meeting was never in doubt. There was no suspense. Will all stories pass? No, we know all stories will pass. They have already been approved. This then led to actually the sprint review being a presentation for the outside world and not so much for the team. That was fine. And of course, we had the retrospective. You can cancel all meetings you want in Scrum, but keep the retrospective. That's the most important one. And of course, we do the daily stand-up meetings. So, how does a scenario come into being? We discovered that there are three stages, and we mapped these 3 stages into our project structure in Visual Studio. So, oops. Here we are. The first stage is under specification. So like during or for the pre-grooming meeting, the scenarios are not fully formalized. That's when they are under specification and they are in their own project, the specification project. They need not be valid Gherkin, need not be automated. The advantage here is if the business analyst checks in a Gherkin file that is completely bogus, the build will not break. So when the scenario has been fully formalized, when it's been scheduled for the iteration, it goes into the user stories project. That's the project where all feature files reside that are currently being worked on. At the end of the iteration, that has to be green. During the iteration, it can be red, but at the end, everything in there must be green. And then, when it's done, then it goes into the features project, which is the repository of all the features that are all the features of the system, let's put it like that. And that must be green every time, at all times. If it's not, then we introduce the bug and we need to fix it. So you notice we have a very high segregation of those scenarios. We physically moved files between projects. I already mentioned the bill not breaking. The automation layer is in a fourth project, so that the automation layer and its IntelliSense can be used in all three projects. So we are now already dealing with 4 different projects. This is a high maintenance effort, especially moving the files. And we also, when a user story was done, we took the scenarios out of the user story file and put them in file for features. So we changed the way we structured the scenarios. This was a very high maintenance effort, I have to admit. We have a potential loss of history in source control. And when I was asked to build up the same structure in another team, we used tags on the scenarios instead of projects, and that's much easier to do. We ended up for our nightly runs to have several nightly runs because, well, we have the stories that are currently being developed. Those may be red. We have the features that were done that must be green. We have customer-specific stuff. So customer A, customer B, customer C, they all want slightly different customizations, or very different customizations too. So we had a separate run for each of those, and then collected all the results on a single at-a-glance web page. Our roles changed a bit from the traditional Scrum roles. The product owner, his job became dealing with the customer. We also had a business analyst. He participated in those dealings with the customer, and then he would do the grunt work of transforming that into Gherkin files. Because our product owner had his qualities, but producing Gherkin files was not one of them. Then the developers, they implement user stories. It's their job. And there was one person, that was again me, who maintained the automation layer. So for each phrase in a Gherkin scenario, you need a bit of code that tells the computer what to do. That's the automation layer. And if you have new phrases, you have to extend the automation layer. That was my task. The results of this setup worked really well. For a while at least, but it worked really well. We had a flow going, all-time high in productivity. We had a flow with requirements coming in and seamlessly being transformed into Gherkin files and implemented and done, and great feeling. Our iteration cycles became shorter because of that. When I started at the company, it was like 4 weeks. Then we moved to 3 weeks, then to 2 weeks. And at our best, we could implement the feature and show it in a matter of days. So, as I said, we went more towards a flow-based model, more like Kanban, and away from Scrum. And now the third part, where unfortunately things did not work so well anymore. I already hinted at some. Now, before we start, I want to say I'm still very proud of the work we did there. We achieved great benefits from our way of working. It's just that, well, at a certain size, our way of working started to break down. We should have adapted a couple of things. Unfortunately, we did not, and so we lived with those cracks. We had problems in the team. As you might have guessed already, if there's one person responsible for, or one person doing something, that person becomes a bottleneck. So the automation layer person, I became a bottleneck. Yeah. We ended up shifting the work of the automation layer towards the whole team, but there was a time where this was really a problem. As I said, we had this business analyst who did the grunt work of converting discussions into Gherkins. He was very productive at this. He produced great quantities of feature files. However, the developers sort of mentally disconnected and just started implementing whatever the business analyst wrote. They did no longer think about this and does this really make sense? Does this work in with the rest of the system? So developers became disconnected from the requirements. I already mentioned we had several nightly runs. At the beginning, I said functional tests that need the whole system and took a long time to complete. So combine this with a lot of feature files, and you have very long test suites. No testing in isolation. All tests had to be run end-to-end. We had lots of scenarios. Bam, long running times. One of the things about BDD is you can do your validation very frequently. That was no longer possible. It took minutes, hours to run the suite. We had no benefit from outside-in development, where you start with the feature file, then develop the automation layer, then your unit tests, then their code, where you go deeper and deeper into the details. But that only works if your feature files can be verified rapidly. We did not have that benefit. We have too many scenarios, and they started to be written like functional tests. So no longer were the scenarios focused on explaining what the system did or the meaning of the system, but it was just a blind functional test. No intelligence in there, just some steps. Also, some people at the customer developed the attitude of, we can test everything. So instead of choosing a small number of well-chosen scenarios that highlight the key aspects of the system, we just had a scenario for everything, and too much detail, too many trees, not enough forest. So the scenarios lost the ability to explain the system. Our living documentation was a huge web page or a huge website that nobody really understood anymore. Yeah, I'm working towards a point with the flickering tests. So we had a couple of 100 scenarios. I already hinted at this. Since this was a complete system with timeouts and waiting for imports to happen and blah, 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 we had timeout problems. We had flickering tests, tests that are sometimes red, sometimes green. So you see it failed, you investigate, it passes. What the hell? As a consequence, we had a small percentage of tests that flickered. We had a large number of tests, so by the law of big numbers, every night some tests would flicker. So every night the test run was red. People stopped trusting the tests. People stopped caring about the tests. Yeah. So there we started losing several of the benefits of behavior-driven development. And we had a lot of detail, but unfortunately the wrong kind of detail. So back to the financial world, Swift is a big word, a big thing in the financial world. Way before Apple invented a programming language called Swift, there was a message standard called Swift, which is essentially a text file, a flat text file, which contains lots of delimiters and qualifiers. And so there are indications that says here starts a section, there ends the section. After a while, you start being able to read it. However, in our scenarios, we would specify the entire message, even though actually one or two things were relevant. And the advantage is you have all information in one place. You know, this is the message. You don't have to look it up somewhere. However, if you have 50 lines of Swift code for just 2 or 3 relevant fields, then yeah, you don't know what is important in this test. You just don't know. It's difficult to grasp the point of the scenario. I already hinted at issues with the collaboration with the customer. In order to reap benefits from behavior-driven development, you need to change your work. The customer was willing are able to do this, but only up to a point. Beyond that point, no. So we could reap benefits until here, but not beyond. I don't think they were necessarily against BDD, but I think they were sort of the prisoners of their own structures, like Swiss private bank, big structures. So yeah. Instead of collaboration, it became more about controlling. Then we had substance abuse with our Gherkin files. Customers treated Gherkin files as a functional test that can be written by a business analyst and will be executed automatically. So I have to speed up. I already said they said, okay, now we can test every possible combination automatically. That doesn't work in reality. So we started even worse, treating the scenarios as a contract set in stone instead of a fluid collaboration tool. And now the conclusions. The point of behavior-driven development is to improve communication and common understanding. This is it, people. If you achieve this better understanding, if you are able to communicate better with each other, you have 80–90% of the benefits of behavior-driven development. Functional testing is only a side effect. I know people talk a lot about this. It's only a side effect. So improved communication, less rework, increased velocity for all you Scrum Masters out there. And we reap those benefits as long as the number of scenarios was relatively small. So don't go overboard. Focus on quality, not quantity. We should have refactored the system to have shorter running times. I think that's obvious by now. What we could have done, we could have spread the runtime, the running of the tests across multiple machines. We could have removed the Swift from the message and just set those single files. Yeah, that's so. Last slide. Thanks you everybody for listening. I'm also moderating the Vienna BDD Meetup meeting. Our next one is on 28 June. As I said, functional testing is only a side effect, but even a side effect needs to be done right. So that's our topic for the next BDD Meetup meeting. Thank you.